Well, that is the real concern here, that you have teachers that want to do the right thing, but essentially these states are criminalizing their behavior. My friend Robert Harvey, that talks about abolitionist teaching, talks about hush harbors that so many teachers need to embrace, which are these opportunities where outside the classroom they kind of come together to figure out how they're going to teach the kids the kind of history that they're supposed to learn. So, as there's this movement almost to criminalize, the teaching of this kind of history, we also have to remember that there are 14,000 school districts in this country, which means that that we're going to consistently hear more stories like this come out as there are consistently more threats against teaching the real history of this country. And I'm concerned that as the accreditation becomes demoted, what happens to those kids who are attempting to go to higher education when those colleges learn about or actually just see sort of this demotion but don't understand the context around it? Does it hurt their chances of actually being on a path to college and career? So we have to think about not just the actual instruction, but on the long-term impacts of not teaching these kids their proper history and demoting the accreditation of these districts themselves.
Basil, why is there an assumption that white children will feel bad if they learned American history accurately? Why wouldn't the assumption be that as a white child, you would see yourself reflected in an abolitionist? Why wouldn't you see yourself in the person that is allied for, to fight for civil rights as opposed to the person on the other end of the Edmund Pettus Bridge?
Well, this isn't about white feelings and white tears. What this is really about is the momentum and mobilization around white evangelical political power. Plain and simple. Look, if we go back historically, we've seen this pattern over and over again where after Brown versus Board of Ed, suburban communities, white communities basically left urban neighborhoods to not have their kids in class with African-American kids. When we were talking about busing into these neighborhoods, they created housing compacts to make sure that not only could these kids be prevented from being bused into these neighborhoods, but that Black kids and Black families couldn't even move into these neighborhoods. So this is not isolated. What's problematic, however, is that we haven't seemed to be able to crack the code. We haven't been able to stop this from occurring, and it's about time that we did, because the one tragic impact of not teaching kids about their history and not educating them properly is they do not go out to then have a lifetime of civic engagement. We know that there's a strong connection there. They know that there's a strong connection there, and they're very intentional about making sure that kids of color who are going to dominate this country in a very short period of time are not going to have the level of civic engagement to be able to undo so much of what has been wrought on those communities.
I'm curious what you think about the idea that this backlash that we're living through and critical race theory being put forward as a boogeyman is a consequence of the 2020 racial reckoning, and the fact that those protests were multiracial, intergenerational, and people in all communities all around America and all around the world, frankly, came outside and said, Black Lives Matter. Is that a threat? Is that why critical race theory is put forward as some sort of boogeyman? Because getting a multiracial coalition to agree on the premise that Black Lives Matter and fight for racial justice, is that a threat to the status quo? And that's why it's being framed this way.
Well, it's absolutely threatening. And what's interesting is a little history is important here, because pre-Brown versus Board of Ed, you had folks like Ella Baker in Harlem, organizing parents around issues related to schools. But that organizing wasn't just meant for schools. It was also about making sure that those parents engaged civically in voting for citywide or statewide election. So what conservatives know and understand is something that African Americans and Democrats have actually practiced for decades, which is you organize the parents around issues with schools, then you can use that to bridge the gap between education and larger political and social issues. And the problem is that Democrats actually we stopped doing that a little bit. Conservatives have started doing that around school choice and other issues, but Democrats have largely stopped doing that. Even the teachers union, who weren't initially aligned with communities of color, are now saying, look, we've got to be partners in this too. That is the coalition that is going to get us over this finish line. We've got to go back to this.